الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا وقرة أعيننا محمد حبيب رب العالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah by Imam al-Shaykh, we've reached the section on wells. And as the fuqaha tell us, that مسائل الآبار مبنية على الآثار لأن القياس أن لا تطهر أبدا. That the fiqh related to wells, its basis is what has been narrated in the athar from the Sahaba and the ijtihadat of the Sahaba. We can understand what it goes back to of broad principles of facilitation in the Sharia, but and of course in the Hanafi school, the opinions of the Sahaba are considered are a source of law, particularly the senior Sahaba, and particularly when the Sahaba agreed on a matter, because it's understood thereby to be, based on their deductive understanding of the Sunnah, if not stronger than that, of actual, basis in something that they learned from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But in either case, this is a source of consequential understanding. So there's, in one sense, we don't have well water to worry about, but in another, there are significance. Why? Because there are many principles that we understand from here, and water systems can get affected by things, and some of these principles do apply to them as well. And we touched upon a little of that at the end of last lesson, as a precursor to this week, so you can see that bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So the Imam al-Shaykh tells us, rahimahullah ta'ala, let's read the matan first. تنزح البئر الصغيرة بوقوع نجاسة وإن قلت من غير الأرواث. A small well becomes filthy if najasa falls in it, even if a little, if it's other than animal excrement. And we'll see, because a little animal excrement is excused from wells, particularly out in the countryside, because it's hard to avoid, especially in open wells. So he says, والواقع فيها روث أو حيوان أو قطرة من دم ونحوه. Right? فصل في مسائل الآبار, the rulings related to wells. والواقع فيها, when that which falls into it is, and you can read al-waqi'u either with rafa, that it's a new sentence, or with kasra, that it is continuing from the title. في مسائل الآبار والواقع فيها, on the rulings related to wells and that which falls into them. Growth, either animal excrements or an actual animal, أو قطرة من دم, or a drop of blood. And he mentions the drop to emphasize even a little bit of najasa. من دم ونحوه, and the like of it, of other, من كل نجس, of all filth. ولو مخففا, Imam Tahtawi says, even if the najasa is light, because لأن التخفيف والتغليظ في المياه سواء, because a najasa being مخففة or مغلظة does not relate to solids, not liquids. Najasa being مخففة and مغلظة, the water, if najasa falls into it, becomes najis. The najasa مخففة is that which a larger amount of it is excluded. But that applies to solids, body, clothes, place of prayer, etc. Does not apply to liquids. Okay. So he says, وَحُكْمُهَا أَن تُنْزَحُ الْبِئْرِ. Its ruling is that the well water is removed. Nazh is removal. Of course, this ascription, تُنْزَحُ الْبِئْرِ أي ماؤها. And this is a common expression in Arabic, because literally, can you remove the well? نزح البئر أي نزح ماء البئر. لأنه من إسناد الفعل إلى البئر, because it is an ascription of the action to the بئر. وإرادة الماء الحال بالبئر. And what is meant is the water that is hal, is contained within the bi'r, الصغيرة, a small well. وهي ما دون 10 في 10, and that is less than 10 by 10, with the difference of opinion that is preceded. Legally, the more rigorous opinion is that a small well is ما يستقله الناظر, is a well that the onlooker would deem to be small, but the fatwa position is 10 by 10. We took that discussion already. بوقوع نجاسة فيها وإن قلت. By if any najasa falls in the well, even if little. وإن قلت أي النجاسة التي من غير الأرواث. If this filth is from other than animal excrement. وقدر القليل كقطرة دم. And an example of a little filth is a drop of blood. وقطرة خمر, right? Such as a drop of wine. لأن قليل النجاسة ينجس قليل الماء, because a little najasa renders a little water, less than 10 by 10, 5 meters by 5 meters, filthy. وإن لم يظهر أثره فيه, even if the trace of the najasa does not manifest in it, meaning in the water. وإن لم يظهر أثره أي أثر النجاسة فيه أي في الماء. وتنزح and بوقوع خنزير ولو خرج حيا, and the well is also cleared of the water that was in it if a pig falls into the water, ولو خرج حيا, even if it comes out of the water alive. Why? Because the khinzir is najisul ayn. The khinzir, all of it is filthy. Okay? والحال أنه لم يصب فمه الماء. Okay? Even if its mouth does not touch the water. لنجاسة عينه, because the entirety of the pig is najis. So that applies only to the pig. وتنزح بموت كلب. Okay? And the water is removed by the death of a dog. He says قيد بموته فيها لأنه أي الكلب غير نجس العين. And the death of the falling of a dog in it is conditioned by the dog dying in the water. Why? Because the dog is not najis al-ayn, ala sahih, according to the correct opinion. And he mentions ala sahih because there's khilaf in it. This is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa. Right? and it's related from both Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, and there's ikhtilaf, is it both their position or not? And one can see that in different books. But Imam Tahtawi says, وَالْفَتْوَى عَلَى قَوْلِ الْإِمَامِ. The fatwa is on the position of the Imam. وَإِنْ رُجِّحَ قَوْلُهُمَا. Even if some scholars deem the position that the kalb is najis al-ayn to be rajih, كما في الدرر, as in the durar of Mullah Khusro. It is very notable because the durar is a big deal. فإنه كتاب في غاية التحقيق, as Ibn Abdin says. And no, he says Afwan, sorry, my fault. It's actually in the Durar, but Tahtawi quotes it كما في الدر عن ابن الشحنة. In the Dur he quotes it from Ibn al-Shihna, and the Durar, and Ibn Abdin mentions that the Durar of Mullah Khusro mentions it is najis, the najis al-ayn. He took that opinion, but Imam al-Shurunbulani pointed out in his Hashiyah on the Durar that that's not the madhab, and likewise other commentators on the Durar also pointed that out. Just as an interlude, the Durar of Mullah Khusro used to be taught in the Ottoman curriculum, which is why there's many hawashi on it. Imam Shurubulani's most legally influential book in fiqh is arguably his Shurun Bulaliya, which is his Hashiyah on the Durar of Mullah Khusro. The Durar of Mullah Khusro also has multiple other hawashi, amongst them the Hashiyah of al-Khadimi, which is delightful, as those of you familiar with al-Khadimi, and also the Hashiyah of Mawla Abdul Halim, who was the Mufti of Damascus, I think beginning of the 11th century, something like that. It also has the Sharh of Shaykh Ismail al-Nabulsi, the father of Shaykh Abdul Ghani al-Nabulsi, called Sharh. It's Sharh al-Durar, and the Durar itself is a commentary on the matan compiled by Mullah Khusro al-Ghurar, and in the Durr al-Mukhtar of Imam al-Haskafi he says, وَمَا كَانَ مِنَ الدُّرَرْ وَالْغُرَرْ لَمْ أَعْزُ إِلَيْهِ إِلَّا مَا نَدَرْ. And that which is in the Durar, Mullah Khusro, I don't refer to it except rarely. So Ibn Abdin says in his Hashiyah, وهو يشير بذلك إلى كثرة نقله واعتماده كالمصنف في متنه وشرحه. So the author of, the author of Durr al-Mukhtar is pointing to how much he quotes. So he says whatever is, because Imam al-Haskafi in the Durr al-Mukhtar says, and he ascribes the different opinions, and he is quoting usually back to where he got it from, except what is from the Durar and its method, the Ghurar. So I rarely ascribe it to him. So Ibn Abdin says, وَيُشِيرُ بِذَلِكَ إِلَى كَثْرَةِ نَقْلِ وَاعْتِمَادِهِ. He's pointing through that to how much he quotes and relies upon the Durar and the Ghurar of Mullah Khusro. كالمصنف, like the Musannif, the author, meaning the author of Tanwir al-Absar, the matan on which the Durr al-Mukhtar is written, في متنه, in his matan, meaning Tanwir al-Absar, وشرحه, and his commentary, because Imam Murtashi, the author of Tanwir al-Absar, wrote a sharh on Tanwir al-Absar called Minah al-Ghaffar, and then Ibn Abdin says, وَهُوَ حَقِيقٌ بِذَلِكَ, and it is deserving of this. فَإِنَّهُ كِتَابٌ مَبْنِيٌّ عَلَى غَايَةِ التَّحْقِيقِ, because it's a book based on the pinnacles of tahqiq, of scholarly verification. It's a brilliant book. Of course, the nature of fiqh is that it's the science of judgment, and it's not, there's no book that's taken unconditionally. And he tackled a lot of challenging issues, and he got a large majority of them spot on. The people who came after, Shurubulali and others, they built upon that. But it's a very, very useful book. It's a very useful book for tafaqquh, which is why in the Ottoman curriculum after the Multaqa, it was very commonly taught. Also taught at al-Azhar, right till the reform of al-Azhar, with the Hashia of Shurubulali. So the dog is not najis al-ayn, ala sahih. Right? فإذا لم يمت وخرج حيا ولم يصل فمه الماء لا ينجس. أو لا ينجس الكلب الماء, or لا ينجس أي الماء. Right? So if إذا لم يمت أي الكلب, if the dog does not die in the water, وخرج الكلب, if the dog comes out حيا, alive, ولم يصل فمه أي فم الكلب, and the mouth of the dog does not reach the water, because the mouth typically has saliva. لا ينجس, and you can read this both ways. Right? لا ينجس الماء, in the first form, right? The water does not become najis, or لا ينجس أي لا ينجس وقوع الكلب الماء. You can read both ways. أو موت شاة أو موت آدمي فيها, or by the death of a sheep. And what's meant is something the size of a sheep. أو آدمي فيها, or the death of a human being in the water. Now, of course, this leads to a question that when the human being dies, is their body najis? Right? And there's two opinions within the madhab on this. Some said that if a human being dies in it, it's because it's inevitable that upon death, because what happens upon death? The limbs relax, so some najasa will come out. So that's why the death of a human being would, in the water, would render it najis. But the other opinion, which appears to be the tahqiq, is that upon death the human being becomes najis, because the human being is a حيوان غير مأكول اللحم, right? That the human being is an animal whose flesh is not eaten. So it takes that ruling. And what's the basis of this? Right? That if a human being dies in the water, he says لنسح ماء زمزم بموت زنجي وأمر سيدنا ابن عباس وسيدنا ابن الزبير رضي الله تعالى عنهم به, أي بنسح الماء. Because during the time of the Sahaba, the water of Zamzam was removed when a zinji, a black slave, died it was found dead in Zamzam, leaned over, whatever, fell in, drowned, died. He died in there, right? And two of the leading companions, Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas and Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Zubayr radiallahu ta'ala anhum, and it's anhum, why? Because both their fathers, we mentioned Ibn Zubayr, it's him and his father. Ibn Abbas, it's him and his father. So it becomes plural. Okay? So they commanded that this be done. بمحضر بمحضر من الصحابة, with in the presence of a large number of Sahaba من غير نكير, without them, without the Sahaba disagreeing on this. Right? So this is akin. I'm not saying it is, but the fuqaha said فهو بمثابة الإجماع السكوتي. So it's akin to a silent ijma'. Right? And you know, in the Hanafi school, the silent ijma' is a hujjah, but certainly the agreement of the Sahaba is of legal weight. In the Hanafi school, it's silent ijma', which is when some of the mujtahids express an opinion, and the other mujtahids are aware of that opinion and they don't express their disagreement. It's considered a type of silent consensus. But there are, of course, parameters to silent consensus. You can't just think, of course, only someone at that level can claim consensus, but silent consensus is considered. Okay, so that is the death of a dog or a sheep or something the size of a sheep, right? And there's some linguistic discussion related to shat. The shat is ismu jins, and it applies to both male and female in general. But there's also a specific name for the male, etc. Right? But if a baby sheep is the size of a cat, it takes the ruling of a cat. Right? So okay. وتنزح بانتفاخ حيوان ولو كان صغيرا, and the well water is also removed if an animal is bloated. Intafakha is to be bloated. Nafakha is to blow. Intafakha is as if is to be bloated, as if someone blew into it. Nafakha is to blow. Intafakha is the ifta'ala, to become blown into, i.e. bloated. Okay? انتفاخ حيوان ولو صغيرا, because its bloating would indicate that the najasa has spread in the water. So, because smaller animals, when they die, you only have to remove a little bit of water, but if it bloated in the water, like the mouse, for example, or cat or whatever, you have to remove all the water. Okay. And then let's just read the matan first. He says, وَمِئَتَا دَلْوٍ لَوْ لَمْ يُمْكِنْ نَزْحُهَا. And one removes 200 bucketfuls of water if it's not possible to remove all the water. This again goes back to that issue of, this is going against Imam Abu Hanifa. So we'll see how and why. And according to Abu Hanifa, because the problem with some wells is that the bit is ma'een, that the water keeps coming into the well. Because if the water table is high, as soon as you take the water, what happens? It gets replaced. And if you really took out all the water, you would deplete actually the water reservoir, the water table under, that's in the ground from which the well is getting water with great harm. So now, what's considered aqiyas, the closer to legal reasoning is that if you cannot remove all the water in the well, then you make taqdeer. يقدر ما فيها من الماء. You make taqdeer how much water is there in the well, and you remove that extent. And that is aqyas. That's closer to the to legal reasoning, to the qiyas. وهو النظر. And that is what legal reasoning would entail. Now, how do you know how much water is in there? That they say الأصل أن ما رجع إلى خبرة فالمرجع فيه أهل الخبرة. The basis is that something that goes back to experience, then one must rely upon those who have experience in such matters. Would you, looking at a well, be able to make a good estimate of how much water was there in the well? Would you? Would you? Have you ever been to a well? Could you make an estimate? It'd be tough, right? Without doing clumsy things. How would we? I wouldn't know how to measure. So you go back to people who have expertise in these things, right? So that is the closer to the qiyas. And that's what the principles of the madhab would entail. But the mutaakhirin generally didn't give fatwa on that. Now the matan would make it appear that in the case where you cannot remove all the water, you immediately resort to what? To 200 dalu. But you see that there's a difference, there's a number of places where there's a slight tweaking of the matan done by the author himself in his commentary. Part of the reason being that there is a time differential between when did Imam Shurungulani write the matan? Then when did he write Imdad al-Fattah? Then when did he write Maraqi al-Falah? And it's of course not a mystery. At the end of the book, the ulama typically mention when they finish the book. And they mention that for important historical purposes. Right? And a lot of people do their ilm in the dark as if there is no light by which to illuminate their understanding. And the ulama often in multiple volume books, they will tell you when they finished that volume. And it's significant because multiple ulama, for example, when did Ibn Abdin write? Ibn Abdin wrote a hashiyah on al-Bahr al-Ra'iq called Minhat al-Khaliq. And he wrote his famous hashiyah, Ibn Abdin. Which came first? Depends which volume you're talking about. So these things are significant. Knowing dates is important because, for example, the author of the Hidayah, there's some books he wrote after the Hidayah. And the latter opinion is given precedence over the earlier opinion. There's an example of that in Sharh Uqud Rasm al-Mufti. Ibn Abdin mentions on that particular issue related to wounds and pus and so on. Ashab al-Quruh. There's an opinion mentioned in one of the later books of al-Marghinani of consideration. So anyways, so he says, وَتُنْزَحُ وُجُوبًا مِئَتَا دَلُو. And one removes, by necessity, 200 bucketfuls if one cannot remove all the water. What is meant by a dalu? What's a bucketful? He says al-wasat. And actually, classically, the ulama gave different descriptive definitions. There's at least three major opinions. Right? One is al-wasat. Right? The other is the bucket used in that well, unless it's unusual. And the other is ghalib تلك البلاد. And what the other is the customary sized buckets in those lands. And there's other opinions. وهو المستعمل كثيرا في تلك البئر. And the mid-sized one is that which is generally used in that well. ويستحب زيادة 100. And it's recommended to add another 100 out of caution. ولو نزح الواجب في أيام أو غسل الثوب النجس في أيام طهور. Okay. He says, and if one removes this extent of water over some days, at the end it becomes pure, just as if one washes a najis item of clothing in it over several days. When the water becomes pure, the item of clothing becomes pure. One is more likely than the other. وتطهر البئر بانفصال الدلو الأخير من فمها عندهما. And the well becomes pure when the final bucket is taken out from the water, according to عندهما, according to Abu Hanifa and Imam Muhammad. And عند محمد بانفصاله عن الماء. And the other, and Muhammad said when the bucket leaves the water. Right? فمها عند فم البئر. So according to Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf, once the bucket comes out of the well, everything that then you say is pure. According to Imam Muhammad, when it leaves the water. And the question would be, when you're taking the final bucket out, what if they get excited and the rope falls back in? They still have one more bucket full to take. And this is because it must have happened. But all of these, it's not they just came up with it. What is the cause of purification? If we say you need to take out, you make a taqdeer, you need to take out 200 buckets. When have you taken 200 buckets out of the water? According to Imam Hanif, you've taken it out of the water, not just by taking it out of the water, but by taking it out from the well. And that's the relied upon position. According to Imam Muhammad, once you removed it, because you have to get the water out from that bucket of water, you took it out from the water. Now when it's parted from the water, if it's separated from the water, if the water is going to be full, what is the relationship between that water now reaching the top of the well and it being pure? His position, and these are subtleties of legal possibility. Okay? And his opinion too has consideration. Okay? And very often fiqh is not about this is right and this is wrong. No, we said this is more correct. But the other position is also like you could stand and defend that for a long time. Right? Okay. He says, وَلَوْ قَطَرَ فِي الْبِئْرِ لِلضَّرُورَةِ. Even if it drips in the water, some water drips out of necessity. The dripping of the water from the bucket is excused, right? It doesn't re-negify the water, right? وَقَالَ يُشْتَرَطُ الْانْفِصَالِ لِبَقَاءِ الْاِتِّصَالِ بِالتَّقَاطُرِ بِهَا. But Imam Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf said, no, يُشْتَرَطُ الْانْفِصَالِ. The bucket has to leave the well, because otherwise the water is effectively still considered connected to the well. And you said, where's that water? It's still in the well, even though it's not. You took the bucket out, but the water is still in the well. And number two, because some of the water is still going to drip. So you give the ruling of having removed 200 buckets when it came out from the well. Anyways, and there's many issues that would arise. What if, so you guys are in picnic state and a mouse died in the well. So Shaykh Yusuf takes responsibility and he's arranging for the proper removal of 200 buckets. But Omar got thirsty, so he says, "Khalas, I'm gonna, because the well is deep, because I'm gonna quickly put down a bucket of water. As soon as Sheikh Yusuf lifts the bucket out of the water, Omar's bucket is ready to take the first amount of water. So he takes the water out while the Sheikh Yusuf purifying bucket is still in the well. Would that bucket be pure or not? But it's a theoretical possibility. But just sometimes these things are mentioned لتشحيد الذهن, to sharpen the mind. It's not got, there's practical application, they're very rare. They're just sharpening the mind for things that are more important, right? It's like when people, practice their martial arts in their bedroom. Like, think you're so strong? Like, what are you doing? Punching the air? But just practice, right? But without practice, you can't fight the real fight. So, okay. وقدر محمد رحمه الله, and قدر الإمام محمد رحمه الله, Imam Muhammad specified the wajib ب200 دلو لو لم يمكن نزحها. He said to remove 200 buckets if it's not possible to remove all the water in the well. أفتى به, he gave fatwa on this position, 200 200 دلو لما شاهد آبار بغداد, when he witnessed the wells of Baghdad. كثيرة المياه, they had a lot of water. لمجاورة دجلة, because they were in close proximity to Dijla. What is Dijla?
The Tigris River.
Are you sure? What's one called Dijla, the other called Tigris? Okay, good. There's two rivers that go through Baghdad, right? Go by Baghdad, which are? Yeah. Furat and Dijla. Right? So he saw the waters of the Dijla being that the wells of Baghdad had a lot of water. So removing all the water would be a hardship, which is of course not connected to whether it's possible or not to remove it. So he says, وَالْأَشْبَهُ أَنْ يُقَدِّرَ مَا فِيهَا بِشَهَادَةِ رَجُلَيْن لَهُمَا خِبْرَةٌ بِأَمْرِ الْمَاءِ. The ashbah, the closer to, ashbah, the one, what is closer, i.e. in similarity to legal reasoning, that's what I say. وَالْأَقْيَسِ is to remove the extent of what's in it with the witness of two people who have expertise in matters related to water. They differ. Do you need two people or is one enough? Right? And one is enough because this is min bab al-ikhbar. And one is enough because this is ikhbar, it's not a shahada. You're not bearing witness. Your ikhbar, one person is enough. But two is more cautious. وهو الأصح, and that is the more correct opinion. أي الأصح فقها, right? It's the more legally correct, right? The other is so some scholars like Ibrahim al-Halabi said that fatwa shouldn't be given unconditionally on the issue of 200 buckets. Rather, to look at if the 200 buckets is a reasonable approximation of the size of the wells over there, or if there's hardship in taking the position of removing all the water in it. It's a really big well. So if there's because if they see it, one is, where are you going to go get somebody like, the water estimator, CDDD, has very high, it's very demanding. Like, we don't want to get his estimate, he's going to give us a hard time. So, you make say, okay, 200, and and get on with it. Or if there's hardship. But the author of An-Nahr al-Fa'iq, he says that this taqdeer is like the taqdeer of 10 by 10. Right? Because it is mundabit. It's more clear, right? It's more firm. And it breaks waswas, it removes waswasa. People get confused. People don't really get things, right? You leave things up to people's opinion, you open gossip. I don't know what Shaykh Yusuf did. I'm not sure if the water is pure. Let's be careful. Let's move town because that well is mashbooh. They do wacky things, right? So here, these things go back to the judgment of the mufti, right? That in general, 200, the 200 dalu is easier. The opinion of removing the extent of the water that's in it is legally sounder. And in Imdad al-Fatawa, said that if there is clear hardship on people, on people by removing even 200 bucketfuls, like such as in a place where there's little water, then it's possible for them to take the opinion of the Shafi'is on just this particular matter, right? And that would be considered valid as Hanafis. Right? So Hanafis in a desert area, they have limited amount of water. They remove 200 buckets of water, they might run out of the water in the dry season. So you just take the opinion of the Shafi'is that, even though we don't fully agree with the hadith, the soundness of the hadith, but it's mujtahid fihi, right? The mat goes under ijtihad. إذا بلغ الماء كلتان if the water reaches the extent of two pullas, like 200 and something liters, لم يحمل الخبث. It does not bear filth. Right? So wells more than 216 liters, najasa falling in it, if it doesn't change color, taste, or smell, would not. But those kinds of things, you don't give fatwa for yourself, you must consult, right? Okay. This is the case where you have to remove all the water. Now you need to diagram this, otherwise you remain confused. وإن مات فيها في البئر دجاجة أو هرة أو نحوها في الجثة ولم تنتفخ لازم نسح 40 دلوة. If something dies in the well that is the size of a dajaja, chicken, or hirra, or a cat, or the like of it, in size, and walam tantafikh, this is an important thing, and it does not become bloated, because if it becomes bloated, it goes into category 1. Right? لازم نسح 40 دلوا. It's necessary to remove the extent of 40 bucketfuls. بعد إخراج الواقع فيها, this very important condition, that in all the cases of a limited number of buckets being taken out, you first have to remove the filth itself. Because if you don't remove the filth, there's no point. Right? So that's very, very important. Right? وإلا لا يفيد. This is of course unless إلا لو لم يمكن إخراج الواقع. Unless it's not possible to remove. So an animal defecated into the water, and it went, and there's muddy soil at the bottom, and you can't tell where the feces is. It's kind of like join the mud, right? So then that would be excused. روي التقدير بالأربعين عن أبي سعيد الخدري. The taqdeer of 40 is related from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri في الدجاجة, right? With respect to the chicken. وما قاربها, and the like of it, يعطى حكمها, and what's like a chicken in size is given of its ruling. وتستحب الزيادة إلى 50 أو 60 لما روي عن عطاء والشعبيات. How do you have thought of that?
الشعبي.
والشعبي, right? والشعبي, right? Yeah. Sorry, I have a reading weird. Yeah. والشعبي. There's a typo in our copy. والشعبي. Yeah, والشعبي, right? Yeah. No. And it's related. The 50 or 60 is related from Ata and Shabi. So the fatwa is 40, 50 or 60 is recommended. Okay? And Imam al-Mardinani preferred 50. And Tahtawi seems to lean a little bit towards that. وإن مات فيها فأرة بالهمس أو نحوها كعصفور ولم ينتفخ, if the like of a mouse or similar, such as a sparrow, dies in it, and it ولم ينتفخ, and it's not bloated, لازم نسر 20 دلوة. One must remove 20 bucketfuls بعد إخراجه, after removing it. Right? But, and here you find in Tahtawi quoting as-Siraj, who is as-Siraj? What is as-Siraj? As-Siraj is as-Siraj al-Wahhaj, which is the original book written by al-Haddadi, the author of al-Jawhar al-Nayyara. He wrote as-Siraj al-Wahhaj, and then he abridged it himself in al-Jawhar al-Nayyara. Right? So if it's not possible to remove it, such as a piece of wood, or a dirty piece of cloth that fell in and is hard, and it's not feasible to remove it, then everything else is considered to be purified in it, right? So 20 bucketfuls in the like of a size of a mouse or sparrow. لقول سيدنا أنس رضي الله تعالى عنه في فأرة ماتت في البئر, because of the position of Sayyidina Anas رضي الله تعالى عنه regarding a mouse that died in a well. وأخرجت من ساعتها, and it was taken out immediately. يعني ينزح 20 دلوة. He said that 20 bucketfuls are removed. Right? Of course, the reference, would you have a reference for this, Omar? For this athar of Sayyidina Anas? Does he reference it?
ذكره الزيلعي في نصب الراية.
And what did he say?
قال في النصب الراية بعد أن ذكر قول أبي سعيد المتقدم وقول أنس قال شيخنا علاء الدين رواهما الطحاوي من طرق وهذات الأثران لم الأثران لم أجدهما في شرح الآثار للطحاوي.
And he says ويستحب الزيادة إلى 30 لاحتمال زيادة الدلو المذكور للأثر على ما قدر به من الوسط. And it's recommended to take out a few extra buckets up to 30 in case the bucket size is smaller than what has been transmitted. It's recommended, it's not obligatory. Caution, in general, the ruling of caution is recommendation, not obligation. Now, if you do this, and if you remove the 20 buckets, there's a problem. What happens to the walls? Because let's say water fell, animal died in the well, water is filthy. What happens to, what does, the water is in contact with what? With the walls and the floor. So what purifies the walls and the floor? The bucket has been going in and out of the well. What happens to the bucket? What happens to the rope? The bucket, the rope, they used to put a thing to, and then you often oil it or polish it, on the top of the well to pull the rope from. That area has been in touch with the rope that was being touched with the najis water. The hands of the person removing, the hands got water that till the last bucket was considered najis. How do you clean all of that? So he tells us, وَكَانَ ذَلِكَ الْمَنْزُوحِ, and this extent, الْمَنْزُوحِ الْقَدْرُ الْمَنْزُوحِ, the extent that is removed, طَهَارَةً لِلْبِئْرِ, it is considered to be a purification for the well, وَالدَّلُّ, and for the bucket, وَالرِّشَاء, and likewise for the rope, وَالْبَكَرَةِ, which is the head of the well, where the rope is leveraged from, وَيَدِ الْمُسْتَقِي, and likewise the hands of the person drawing the water. روي ذلك عن أبي يوسف والحسن. This is related from Abu Yusuf and Al-Hasan. Al-Hasan here referring to Hasan ibn Ziyad, not Al-Basri or Ibn Ali رضي الله عنه الجميع. لأن نجاسة هذه الأشياء كانت بنجاسة الماء, because the filth of these things was by the filth of the water. فتكون طهارتها بطهارته نفيا للحرج. Therefore we deem these things to be pure by the water now being deemed pure. نفيا للحرج, to negate hardship. وهو مدفوع شرعا وعقلا. To really provoke the Shafi'i, we say عقلا وشرعا, because hardship is lifted legally, and Hanafis to provoke the Shafi'i, and rationally, because you cannot live. There's a rational case why hardship should be lifted in religion and life, but that's a separate matter. كطهارة دن الخمر بتخللها, like the bucket of wine is deemed pure if the wine turns into vinegar. Otherwise it would never become pure, right? The wine becomes vinegar, but if you say the wine had made the bucket, what's it called? I don't know what the wine, but the barrel, or whatever it's called. Yeah.
Casket.
What?
Casket, maybe?
Whatever. Right? We don't need to know the name for it, right? The bucket of, the barrel of wine, right? It was in touch with the wine, so the barrel inside was najis. But now if the wine itself turned into vinegar, if you said that the barrel remained najis, then the point that this there's a flipping of chemical state. If you said, oh, but the bucket was filthy inside, then it would never purify. That's haraj. Right? So this is كطهارة الدم بتخللها وطهارة عروة الإبريق بطهارة اليد إذا أخذها كلما غسل يده. So likewise, if someone is making istinja, and they keep picking up the bucket, even with the wrong hand, in the event, eventually, the ibriq, the bucket, you deem that that's purified in making istinja or izalat al-najasa. That when you make istinja, the hand that you use for the istinja becomes pure once the mahal becomes pure, unless there's traces of filth. Is it obligatory to wash it again? No. It's recommended, but not obligatory. وروي عن أبي يوسف أن الأربعة من الفئران كفأرة واحدة والخمسة كالدجاجة إلى التسع وَالْعَشْرَ كَالشَّاةِ. And it's related from Yusuf that 4 mice are like 1 mouse in the amount that's removed, and 5 are like a chicken, up to 9, and the 10 is like a sheep. And there's all that how much you have to remove, you could consider them together. It says ruya, it is related. Right? This is min siyaq al-istib'ad, of distancing himself a little bit from the opinion. وقال محمد الثلاث إلى الخمس كالهرة. Said 3 to 5 are like a cat. والست كالكلب, and 6 are like a dog. وهو ظاهر الرواية. And this is ظاهر الرواية. This is the main transmission from Imam Abu Hanifa. Ruya, it is related. This is from Siyaq al-Istib'ad. He's distancing himself from that opinion. وما كان بين الفأرة والهرة فحكمها حكم الفأرة. Anything between a mouse and a cat is like a mouse in terms of how many buckets you remove. وما كان بين الهرة والكلب فحكمه حكم الهرة. And anything between a cat and a dog takes the ruling of a cat in terms of how much is removed. وإن وقع فأرة وهرة فهما كهرة. And if a cat and a mouse fall into the water, it's like one cat falling into the water. You only have to remove that extent of water. ويدخل الأقل في الأكثر. And this is the principle that the lesser is included تبعا as following the أكثر. Because التابع لا يفرد بالحكم. There's actually a legal principle, very simple principle, which is التابع تابع. You know, التابع, that which is you have al-asl and al-taba'. You have the main thing, and you have the taba', that which follows it. Right? And they say, so there's 2 principles related to the main thing and its detail. One is al-tabi' tabi'. You can find these qawaid in the opening of the Majalla. Al-tabi'u tabi', and the second one, al-tabi'u la yufradu bil-hukm. That the follower of something or its detail is not considered independently in ruling. And this has, of course, numerous applications. Amongst them, just to mention a practical point related to tahara and najasa, what's the ruling of buying a pig leather shoe?
Have you cured the leather?
Yeah. You have mega cured the leather. Does it make any difference? Got to review our, if we've taken this in early law. ويطلب الجلد بالدباغ إلا جلد الخنزير والآدمي. الخنزير لنجاسته والآدمي لكرامته. Of course it's haram. It's najas al-ayn. The pigskin is not rendered pure. So a pigskin shoe is haram. But what about a leather shoe from like cowhide or whatever, but the lining is pigskin? That's why never give fatwa. Like if someone, because you say, well, it's more caution. Hold on. Never give fatwa. Why? Because what if someone works in a shoe store? Right? Real case. And I asked, right? Like the issue came up. And also came up with one of my, is it haram to sell those? Is it haram to buy them? And if you have it, is it haram to keep? Someone is poor. There's a time when one of the very distinguished scholars of our times, poor guy was totally broke. Someone told him that his shoes were pigskin. Which is great discern, because the person wasn't sure. This Shaykh, to be cautious, was wearing plastic bags on top of his socks with his shoes, because he couldn't afford anything. And being Shafi'is, very tough. I said, Sayyidi, do you know what makes the skin pink? He said, no. Are you sure that najis? He said, no. Then assume they're tahir. So what if they're not? He said, your Lord is more merciful than that. Right? So I told him to ask Shaykh Amjad, and he said, of course. And najasa is not established by doubt. So anyways, But, and it's not haram to sell. There's karaha in selling it. Because what are you selling? You're selling a leather shoe. The pigskin lining is considered tabi'ah. Of course, I didn't make up that ruling. We asked four senior, we've asked three Dar al-Iftaz in the Indian subcontinent, and one of the senior Hanafi fuqaha, and all of them gave the same ruling. Right? And I confirmed it later with other ulama. It's not a joke. It's people's deen. And then he mentions things that are excused. Right? He mentions things that are excused. So we will pause here for Maghrib and then continue bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So we'll be back online in about 10 minutes. Bi'idhnillah.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala al-falah. Hayya ala al-falah. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah.
Regular attendance?
It's like your birthday.
No, but I think you have to take extra water because
It's gonna be regular or close to regular.
Oh, mine's, no, this makes it more difficult.
the Sunday.
No, after September, we will be having 2 Maraqi classes.
Yeah, Sunday, right? So the other one will be Sunday 9 to Sunday.
Is that the new show?
No, I remember seeing one.
I don't think we decided on a day, but there's going to be a second Maraqi session, twice a week, 2 hours. But we don't know the time.
No, I've seen the Tahfaz too.
I don't know, I've been following on that.
I haven't been following the
Okay.
Yeah, I guess.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح قام الصلاة قام الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله الله أكبر الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين ألهاكم التكاثر حتى زرتم المقابر كلا سوف تعلمون ثم كلا سوف تعلمون كلا لو تعلمون علم اليقين لترون الجحيم الله سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لا إله إلا الله. So we start after the sunnah. Are you guys here to break some shelves? You guys have instructions? You have one more month?
I have her number, but I thought we'd just go first.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, I can. Actually, could you come here?
Which one is that? No, no, this one. And I tried it and it didn't work. Yes, when I walk in, try to do what? Yeah, so I walk in. Yeah, just in case, somebody walks in. Information list.
I'll give you the cable to copy it. Bismillah. So he gives us the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The author tells us about the things that make the well najis. But then, in general, there is principles that hover around the fiqh. Now, the important thing to understand with the principles of fiqh, the principles is that you cannot give a fatwa or establish a ruling based on principles, right? These qawa'id are guiding considerations, but the rulings are not established by the qawa'id. Rulings of fiqh are established for the mujtahid from the usul al-tashri', the Quran, the Sunnah, Qiyas, Ijma', etc. And for the muqallid, even the fuqaha, who are ahl al-taqleed, by what's called takhrij, by them deriving rulings from the rulings established by the mujtahid. Okay? So it's like new rules are established by the higher courts. Right? So the new issue, the case goes up to the level of judge who has jurisdiction to issue new principles. Right? Lower courts, what do? They apply established rulings or extend them to the extent of what's the jurisdiction of that particular level of court. It's conceptually similar. That's why they talk about tabaqatul fuqaha, the gradations of the scholars. We'll be getting to that when we look at how the Hanafi school works, but just to be aware of it. Now, hardship is lifted. Ad-darar yuzal. The problem with animals is they run around. In the countryside, animals come and drink water. And animals do what animals do. They defecate. Right? There's birds that fly, they do aerial bombing of wells. So what do you do with all of that? So he tells us. And the general principle is, one, that al-haraj madfu', hardship is warded off. Number one. Right? By the primary text, وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ. Allah has placed no hardship for you in matters of religion. Tahara is based on taysir, on facilitation. And while, now with water, there are conflicting considerations. At the one level, أُمِرْنَا بِحِفْظِ الْمَاءِ, we've been commanded to guard water from being filthy. Okay? And there's a whole number of hadith related to that. There's a whole bunch of fiqh related. But at the same time, it's based on facilitation, as we saw from the Athar. For example, there's many other texts. The Athar of Sayyidina Umar with Amr ibn al-As. Ya sahib al-hawd la tukhbirna. Right? Oh, when they came to the pool of water, Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As, acting on the dictates of caution, said, Ya sahib al-hawd, hal yaridu hawdaka as-siba'u. Sayyidina Umar interjected and said, Ya sahib al-hawd la tukhbirna. Do wild animals drink from your water? Asked Amr ibn al-As. Sayyidina Umar said, O owner of the pool, do not tell us. And he put his hand in the water, he already had permission, and started using the water. There's many other texts which you can find in the works of hadith with respect to water. Now, so he tells us, وَلَا تَنْجُسُ الْبِئْرُ بِالْبَعْرِ وَالرَّوْثِ وَالْخِثِّ إِلَّا أَنْ يَسْتَكْذِرَهُ النَّاظِرُ. The well does not become filthy with the excrement of camels and cattle, right? And cows, unless the onlooker would deem it to be a lot. That's the relied upon position. There's a facilitative opinion which you mentioned next. أن لا يخلق دلو من بعرة, or it be such that no bucket is free of a piece of excrement. This is a secondary opinion that is meant to be approximated. You don't know if it's a lot or not, take the approximative opinion. Now he uses these three words, ba'ar, rawth, and khithi, right? The well does not become najis with ba'ar, which is the excrement of وَلِلْإِبْلِ وَالْغَنَمِ. It is for the camel and ghanam, cattle, sheep, goats. وَبَعَرَ يَبْعَرُ مِنْ حَدِّ مَنَعَ يَمْنَعُ. Right? بَعَرَ يَعْبَرُ. And that is the والروث, or the roth, which is للفرس والبغل والحمار, which is for horses, mules, and donkeys. من حد نصر, right? روث نصر ينصر, روث يربث, right? That's hardly you. والخثي بكسر الخاء وحيدة الأخثاء, which is للبقر, which is for cows. من باب ضرب, ضرب يضرب, خثى يخثي. ولا فرق بين آباء الأمصار والفلوات في الصحيح. And this applies both to the wells of cities and the falawat and the open areas, like the countryside, according to the relied upon position. Why? Because cattle are also found in the city. Someone, they come to the market, etc. So the hardship would be there. Where cattle are found, the hardship would be present. ولا فرق بين الرطب واليابس. And there's no difference between moist and dry. والصحيح والمنكسر, and sound excrement and excrement that is broken. في ظاهر الرواية, right? According to the main transmission. Now here, Imam al-Tahtawi says it would be better to have said على الصحيح, right? Because there's some discussion, what is ظاهر الرواية? This is the sound opinion in the madhab, right? According to what the fuqaha have deemed, what is ظاهر الرواية? And it would appear, if you look at what Imam Sarakhsi actually says in al-Mabsut, that this, what would appear to be understood from ظاهر الرواية would be some tafsil, right? Allahu a'lam. Anyways, بشمول الضرورة. Why? The reason being because because the hardship, the darura, encompasses them all. Now, the term darura broadly has two usages. There's an usuli usage. Darura is al-halat al-mulji'a. It's a desperate circumstance. Darura is that which, so you have, needs are at three levels according to usul. Right? You have daruriyat, right? Is necessities, which is mala tastaqi, which if missed, it threatens life or limb. Right? Then you have hajat, needs, which if not fulfilled, your basic interests are not fulfilled. Right? Do you need shoes are shoes a necessity? No, you could walk barefoot. You're gonna lose life or limb by walking. There's all barefoot movement. Shoes are a need, they're not a necessity. Broadly. Is it a necessity to have a car? No, you can have public transportation. Is it a necessity to have a kufi? No. It's a sunnah, right? But is it a need to cover your aura? Trick question. It's a necessity. Because covering the aura is a necessity. Right? Because there's no option to do without it. Please. I want to make sure next class you come, it's a necessity. What is it? It's darura. Right? Right? And then there's tahsinat. Right? Then there are tahsinat are things that adorn your life. Right? You can call these are wants. And even when thinking of purchasing, you think about it these three levels: necessities, needs, and wants. I want this. I would like this, right? So that we have some clarity. Okay. So, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Because the necessity, but that's according to the usulis. Necessity is a state of, it's a dire state. If not fulfilled, there's threat to life or limb, right? But the fuqaha, that's the usuli usage of necessity. The fuqaha don't use darura in that sense. And a lot of bad fiqh arises from superficial readings of fiqh by not distinguishing between usages. The fuqaha use the term necessity frequently. They use the term darura ila ma fihi haja, something where there's need. Right? There's hardship, but it's not devastating hardship. Right? Maybe you have to get rid of the water from the well. It's not devastating. Right? You could find water somewhere else. But there's ما فيه حرج. There's al-darar. There's some level of hardship. Right? That's important to keep in mind. Okay. لشمول الضرورة فلا تنجس. So none of these types of excrement render it filthy. So the itlaq of the method, the unconditioned, that any type of excrement from the aforementioned animals takes a ruling. إلا أن يكون كثيرا, unless it's a lot. وهو ما يستكثره الناظر. Unless it's a lot, which is what the onlooker would deem a lot. والقليل ما يستقله. And a little bit of excrement is that which the onlooker would deem a little. Imam al-Shulbulali rahimahullah ta'ala says وعليه الاعتماد, and upon it is the reliance. Right? It is like one of the ways of indicating the strength of an opinion. Upon it is the reliance. But it's min siyagh al-hasr. Right? Because if you say على الصحيح, according to the sound opinion, what does it indicate? That it's sound. Right? But عليه الاعتماد, upon it is the reliance. Right? وهو المعتمد, it is the relied upon. We say عليه الاعتماد, upon this is the reliance, meaning أي لا غير. Right? So it's من صيغ الحصر. Right? That it's limiting. And this is also, of course, mentioned in the Tanwir and the Dur. And the basis is, as the Dur says, لأن أبا حنيفة رحمه الله لا يقدر شيئا بالرأي. Because Imam Abu Hanifa does not give any limits by mere opinion. Right? And there's a lot of principles related to that. لأن المقادير لا تنصب إلا من قبل الشارع. Because limits are only established by the lawgiver. And of course at the levels of indication. Explicitly by indication, implication, etc. وما لم يقدر فالمرجع فيه إلى رأي المبتدأ. And that which there is not a limit, they say, well, a lot versus a little, the asl is that it goes back to the judgment of the one affected. But the problem with that is that what if the one affected is clueless? So the duty of the fuqaha to give clarity, bayan. Right? So, أو, right, this is للتخيير خاصة عند التحير أو التوسوس, right, especially if someone's confused or has waswasa, and لا يخلو دلو عن بعرة, or if no bucket is free of a piece of excrement, ونحوها, or the like of it, كما صححه في المبسوط, as was chosen in the مبسوط. And Imam Sarakhsi is a big deal in the Hanafi madhab. Shamsul A'imma, al-Sarakhsi, the great, and one of the great books, and very often, I mean, the later books are great, right? And they're where we take fatwa from, etc., 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 etc. But one cannot neglect, well, I mean, one reading from others, but some experience of them. You know, a lot of people neglect the mabsut of Imam Sarakhsi to their own detriment. They neglect the Bada'i' al-Sana'i' to their folly. Particularly, these are pre-Hidayah books that cannot be ignored, right? And they're also characterized by real clarity of expression and nuance. Likewise, other books like Imam al-Jassas, Mukhtasar al-Tahawi, for legal reasoning, dazzling, and you know other books. But after learning how to navigate the madhab, not blindly. He says, ولا يفسد أي لا ينجس الماء بخرق حمام, and the water is not spoiled. You know, لا يفسد أي لا ينجس, meaning it is not rendered najis بخرق الحمام, by the excrement of what's hamam? What's hamam? What's hamam?
The bird.
What? What's hamam? Hamam is a very important creature in poetry.
It's a type of bird.
I know it's a type of bird.
It's a dove.
Yeah, it's a hamam is like a pigeon or a dove, right? Right? الخرق بفتح يعني بالفتح واحد الخرق بالفتح واحد الخرق بالضم مثل قرق وقرق, وعن الجوهري بالضم. And this can be said خرق or خرق كجل وجنود, والواو بعد الراء غلط, خرق, right? وخرو ولا ينجس بخرق عصفور, and it's also not rendered filthy with the excrement of pigeons, of a sparrow, ونحوها, and the like of it, مما يؤكل من الطيور غير الدجاج والإوز, of edible birds other than hens, and what's iwas? And one person has an excuse because they're getting married. But there's, you gotta look up words. What's iwas? What's a duck? What's a duck-like creature? You look it up. No, not now. Did you? No, it's not acceptable. Okay. Okay. Even for chickens and swans, and likewise a duck, as Imam Tahtawi mentions, ومثلهما البط, and likewise a duck. Okay. So now we'll see why are pigeons given an excuse, but in general there are 3 rulings for bird, for khut of birds. There are 3 rulings. We're going to stop here, partly because that's what happens when you don't prepare. And words matter. And vocabulary is very important. Right? So please don't wing it when it comes to vocabulary. And it's not just in fiqh books. Like the hammam is used as a metaphor, hammam, which is a pigeon or a dove, because as a metaphor for love. What does the hammam do? Nawhul hammam, right? The moaning of doves, right? They said is like a metaphor for the painful yearning of the lover. Nawhul hammam, right? So the balabil, the bulbul, sings in yearning. Right? So the different birds and their songs express different states of those in love. أما تنظر الطير المقفصة يا فتى. Do you not see the bird caged up, O youth? Right? Right? يهزهزها الشوق للعالم الأسنى. It is shaken by its passion for the sacred realms. يغرد بالتفريد ما بفؤاده فتضطرب الأعضاء في الحس والمعنى. It sings in sweet songs that which is within its heart, meaning of the meanings of love. فتضطرب الأعضاء, so its limbs shake tangibly and in spirit. فتضطرب الأعضاء, its limbs shake outwardly and inwardly. كذلك أرواح المحبين يا فتى. Like such are the souls of lovers, O youth. يهزهزها العالم الأسنى. They are shaken by their yearning for the higher worlds. Anyways, so the point being, like here, look up these words. We'll finish up this section. Okay, so what I want you to do for next week, and we'll stop there, right, is there's ruling, right? The khur, right? I'd like to see a diagramming of the rulings of birds, because some bird excrement is najis, some bird excrement is pure, and some bird excrement is najasa mukhaffafa, right? So there's 3 types of bird excrement: pure, najasa mughallada, and there's one that has khilaf on it. So I'd like to know what the 3 are. there. And then the issue of what happens if, but there's a lot more animals coming up, please. There's no excuse for looking up animal any names. My intention was to go till 9:30.